So recently I've done a study looking at black, migrant and Muslim young women in schools. And this has shown some exciting new revelations, some positive, some, some in need of some considerations. But for example, um, the schools that I went to, the Muslim women were from a range of countries such as Somalia, Burundi, Uganda, um, Nigeria, um, Afghanistan. I'm thinking of all the countries now. They were from Bangladesh. Did I say Pakistan? um, but so they were from a range of countries from all over the world. And the young Muslim women um, had a very positive sense of identity. Many of them wore the hijab. In one school, the hijab was part of the uniform, actually. It was an all girls school. And they were a very positive outlook and a very career orientated. And what was, I suppose, quite exciting, some of them were the first generation in their families to be in Britain, to speak English fluently because their parents may not have spoken English fluently. Some did, some didn't. But so they were navigating the educational system through their own determination, and the young women were seen by their teachers again in both a positive and a negative way. So the teachers saw them as being part of a Muslim tradition, which they saw as quite backward, that was couched in religion, patriarchal religions, which they felt that the Muslim girls were not necessarily empowered, and many of the teachers set about empowering these young women, and I call it trying to save them from their own cultures. And remember, I think it's something like 87% of teachers in Britain are white, very few Muslim and black teachers. So the way in which the schools were approaching them, the white framework for understanding Muslim girls is very much through notions of oppression of women, and teachers set about trying to save these women from themselves. By that I mean, in one school, a teacher, she was a head of diversity and inclusion in her school. She was a white woman, and she was very upset and told me that why are the Muslim girls wearing makeup, and why are they wearing big earrings? If they were good Muslim girls, they shouldn't be, celebrating their looks in this way. They should be wearing the hijab and being demure and so on. And it was she was a white woman interpreting a very prudish sense of Islam. There was no idea that the young women weren't adapting and resisting through dress in other ways, and why shouldn't they celebrate their sexuality and their sense of self in the way that they wanted to? So she was policing, and I call it surveillance. They were being surveillance and being watched and being educated and so-called empowered. And education is empowering, and I'm not saying that empowering is bad, but there was a sense in which white Western feminism was the right pathway for these young girls. But the girls had their own sense of their pathways and their own sense of their religious and faith beliefs, and what was happening in these schools was another thing. So I'm saying that this idea of empowerment and white feminism was an issue, but what really did disturb me, and I'd be very interested in your views on this, was the black on black bullying, the Muslim on Muslim bullying. So, for example, one Afghani girl was saying that, a young Afghani boy in the school had liked her and she had rejected him. And he went around spreading rumors about her to the parents, to the brothers, to other people in the school, that she was seeing boys, and she got bullied and abused and at home and at school. And there was a young woman from Burundi, for example, and she wore the full hijab, the hijab and the whole abaya, and she said that that she was very badly bullied because she was very dark skinned by the other black boys in the school and black girls in the school. So there was black on black bullying. So the bullying and the surveillance within our own communities is something that Toni Morrison, a black feminist and a very famous writer, has said, you know, we have to expose the racism and the sexism within our own communities. And as black feminists, it's not an easy thing to do because you lay your communities bare. And if we look at issues like violence against women in our communities, it most definitely, and particularly in COVID, has been heightened very much. And one of the issues for black feminists has been the work that we're doing around sexual violence in our communities, FGM, female genital mutilation, forced marriage. Groups like Southall Black Sisters have campaigned long and hard against those violations. There are issues to do with the intersection of race and gender and migration for many women of colour, because they often cannot leave their families or their violent husbands because there's no recourse to public funds, so that if they leave them, they'll be destitute. So they have to stay, or their immigration status is not secure. So if they leave their husbands, they're dependent on their husbands. Maybe their husbands take their passports sometimes, and they are stuck in violent relationships. So these issues of violence in our own communities and the racism, the black on black racism, I think, and the Muslim on Muslim racism and sexism, the power dynamics in our community, the patriarchy, is something that the girls were fighting against. And I don't think the teachers understood this. And in a survey we did across some of the schools, we found that particularly Muslim and migrant girls suffered very severe mental health issues. There were eating disorders, there were attempts at suicide because of unhappiness and being trapped in certain kind of family relationships, not being able to express their friendship groups, you know, policing their activities. And I was quite shocked that, say, like out of 100 girls, at least 12 were severely depressed and self-harming. So these issues in our communities need to be discussed, and black feminism as a framework and the intersectional framework gives us that power to voice the positions that we're in and discuss the complexities of not, this has been a constant problem, of not dissing our men because that is a problem for us. We want to stand head and shoulders with our men folk and our communities, but at the same time we need to have the freedom to talk about issues as it arises for us in those communities. We need to look at the wider discourses. And by discourses I mean the power dynamics in society. So we have several, for example, we're living in times of mass migration. Even though we have Brexit, it doesn't mean that migration isn't and not going to happen. It will. And so we have vast numbers of people moving from the global south because of climate change, because of war, into the northern European countries. And the northern European countries definitely need the labour that we bring, and all the resourcing and the education and the skills, but these this forces of globalization. So these are the wider discourses that affect the intersectional experiences that we have, those avenues that I talked about earlier of disadvantage and advantage and discrimination. So we have globalization as one of them, but we also have migration and nationality. So if you don't have citizenship and you don't have nationality, or British nationality, for example, you are very precarious. And by precarious, I mean in a vulnerable position. The young woman from Burundi who was being bullied, she was a refugee. Her father was killed in the war, and her mother was severely traumatized and was depressed. And as a 16-year-old, she was caring for her mother, her brother, a sister, and going to school. So they told me, don't interview Shani. She's useless. She truants. She doesn't come to school. She doesn't care. And she doesn't care about education. And when I met her, it was the total opposite. She was totally devoted to schooling. But because her circumstances were so difficult, the migration, the globalization, and also the other forces of Islamophobia, the idea of terror, and that comes with being a Muslim, all those things came together. Her religious position, the patriarchy that constructs that religion, that was flowing in through her. The idea of, one thing that really frames the life of many women, whether or not you're Muslim or Christian or but women of color, is the idea of honor and shame. You don't step out of your culture because of the shame that you will bring to your families. And so you stay in positions that you don't want to be in. And Shani was very much, ashamed and wanted to uphold the family honor. So she struggled every day to go to school and didn't ask for help. This is something that is very foundational in our cultures. And foundations of racism still remain very firmly lodged in the way that we have opportunities. So, for example, even if you go to university and you're a young person of color, male or female, you are less likely to get good graduate employment at the same pay level as your white counterparts. And this is something we've been tracking for 30 years, and we don't seem to be able to overcome it because the racism of employers means that the young people going through that don't get the same kind of opportunities and find it incredibly hard to get a job afterwards. So that's another avenue of disadvantage that flows through the intersectional model, that of racism, in structural racism, institutional racism in our society.